before I was kind of stalling. Okay, he's over to my right. Okay. Brothers and sisters, can you bring your hands together and let's give a good greeting to our speaker, Professor Amos Wilson.
Thank you very much for your welcome. Thanks to Sematab for the invitation. And it's a pleasure to talk with you here again today. I'm going to talk a bit today here about black-on-black violence, causes, effects, and cures related to my current publication, Black-on-Black Violence, the psychodynamics of black self-annihilation in service of white domination. And the title is somewhat lengthy, but I felt it was necessary to add that subtitle so that people upon seeing the book would immediately get an idea of what we were concerned here with, and get an idea of what role black-on-black violence serves in this society that we live in. That black-on-black violence is not merely an expression of personal and individual anger, or just merely the result of a psychopathological personality, but is more the result of a psychopathological social system. I wanted to impress upon people that black-on-black violence serves a social function, that in effect it becomes a necessary part of the functioning American system. In a sense, it operates to maintain this system. In fact, if I had a book here, I'd read a quotation I took from Isaiah, I think it's 53, something like that, where he talks about the scapegoat here. Of course, people read that to imply that he's talking about Jesus, which is no problem because, in a sense, Jesus is a supreme scapegoat as well, you see. He talks about the fact that this man who appeared to be afflicted of God, smitten of God, the man from whom we hid our face, whom we spurned, but upon whom we depended to maintain our own holiness. And it is our sins that he, takes upon himself. In other words, the sins of this country, the sins of this society, are placed upon black people, and in particular the black male. And that black male is then used as a scapegoat and a vehicle for the sins of the society itself, and consequently helps to maintain particularly the white American society. And I want us to keep that in mind, or otherwise we'll fall into a trap of blaming the victim and ignoring the source of the problems. This is a complicated subject, at least it would take some time, so obviously I cannot go into great detail about it. So today I'm essentially going to offer an outline of what I see as some of the causes, effects, and cures for black-on-black violence. Hopefully then you will keep this outline in mind and meditate on the outline and fill in the details, which I will not have time to talk about today. The thing that I try to emphasize again and again is that when you talk about black issues regarding African people, that you talk about them in terms of the context in which they occur. Many of us who are well-intentioned often get involved in discussing issues confronting our communities, in exploring solutions to the problems that we discuss, and find often that our solutions do not work as well as we would expect them to. This is often the result of the fact that the discussion takes place outside of the context of the reality in which we live as people. We'll discuss black male and female relations as if it's purely a matter of the personalities of black males and black females. As if these personalities themselves are not personality representations of a social system. As if the fights or whatever struggles they may carry out are not at some level representative of a social structure. And therefore it requires that we are to understand the dynamics of black male-female relations. We must understand how the social system in which these conflicts takes place contributes to those conflicts. The same thing occurs when we deal with the issue of the education of African children. We'll often then get caught up in technique, reading technique or things of this nature as solutions to the educational problems of our children. When we fail to ignore, when we don't look at the social context, we will see then, despite the fact of all of the techniques we may project, we still have educational problems. The same thing then must be looked at when we talk about black on black violence, or so-called criminality. It becomes dangerous not to look at the context of that so-called criminality of violence. We must recognize that crime of violence and violent expression, these are social products. People don't rob for the same thing in different cultures. They're not motivated to achieve the same thing in different cultures. In other words, the very objectives of a criminal activity, the very objectives of violent activity is socially determined. So what people rob for, or what they decide to steal, the kind of black market activities they enter into and so forth, is determined by the cultural context in which they live, which indicates then that at bottom, the source and motivations of crime and criminality and violence and so forth is socially rooted. If you ignore the social context, then you will get engaged in blaming the victim and seeing then certain people as innately criminal. And of course, this is what this society would like for us to do, so that we can engage in self-blame and not deal with the system itself and the contribution it makes. It wants us to engage in this kind of thinking so that we can no longer perceive those that lead the society as the true criminals, and to deceive us into believing that this society itself is not crimogenic. That is, it is not the source of crime. Black on black violence is a manifestation of white on black violence. And to a great extent, it is a reaction to white on black violence. America is founded on violence. America is founded on the most gross criminal and savage activities of any other nation. You know, we often deceive, if you read white business publications. In fact, one evening I was with a couple of friends and we were looking through the New York Times magazine, and they were talking about business organization, management technique. And if you looked at it closely, it would appear that the whites were saying, we are where we are because we have management genius. And we know how to manage businesses. And we've taught the world management skills, marketing skills, advertising skills, and we're just great business people. Then another friend of mine, though, indicated, but they didn't tell you how they just came over and at the end of a gun took this country. And that the ultimate basis then for their being in business is not management skills. It's not the fact that they have MBAs from Harvard or Yale, or the fact that they go to the Wharton School of Finance. That's far after the fact that these people engage in wholesale murder, wholesale rape and robbery. And this is one of the realities, you know, we have to learn as people. We don't want to face the harsh realities of the way the world operates. And we don't want to look at nations and societies and their origins and recognize that when you look at them, you will see them originating in theft and robbery, rape and murder. Those of you who even read the Bible will look and see the Israelites taking another people's land. Even though they said they were promised that land, they still had to fight and they still had to run the inhabitants out. The inhabitants didn't say, welcome Israelites, it's yours, we're going somewhere else. No, they had to fight wars. And you'll see later on, some of you heard Reverend Butts talking this week, of where their God told them that they had the right to go into other nations and kill everything living. Cats, dogs, mules, cows, the whole bit. And wipe them out completely. And if some of you know the story of Samuel, you will see what happened there to King Saul when he decided to bring back some animals. And Samuel says, what? I told you to kill what? Everything. And Saul said, well, these are nice, you know, how can we kill all of these? He even had nerve enough to bring back the king of the country. He says, no, the rule was what? You destroy everything. And he sat there, and I believe it was Samuel sat there and chopped the king up right on the spot. And of course, Saul was punished with madness and everything else. What am I trying to say? That we often forget origins. And we often forget that the origins of nations becomes a part of those nations' character. Just as our individual origins as children, and children in families, and children in communities, becomes a part of our adult personalities. The past still remains with us and an operating part of our present. So we see then the origin of America in the murder and the destruction of nations. America began as one of the most dastardly crimes against humanity that has ever been visited upon people. That origin is still in America today. It is the refusal of this society to face up to that original murder and death. It is this society's ongoing attempt to rationalize its killing and murder of Indians that has skewed its whole consciousness today, its morality and its values. They have sought to cover over those criminal activities. And in covering over those criminal activities and denying the original criminal activities, in rationalizing those criminal activities, they lie to the people of this nation, and they create a false consciousness and a false sense of reality in the people of this nation, and consequently they continue their crimes. And they stimulate ongoing crime within their own society. The other origin of this nation, of course, is the enslavement of our people. The extortion of the labor from our people. The manslaughter of our people as they came across the Middle Passage. The misuse and abuse of our people. This nation then was found upon the degradation of two major sets of people, Africans and Native Americans. This country today is still trying to deal with its origins. Someone tells me this current movie, Dancing with Wolves? You'll see a nation going through the same kinds of attempts to cope with guilt and conflict as you see in individuals. One of the mechanisms individuals use when they're dealing with conflict and traumatic events in their lives, of course, is fantasy. And in a sense, we can look at movies as a type of fantasy. They have never come to terms with what they did to Indians. So now, of course, they're going to try to repay their debt for the dastardly deeds they did by running a movie and projecting the image of the Indian in a positive sort of way. I haven't seen the movie, that's what they tell me that they're trying to do there. You see? But fantasizing and getting engaged. So now, instead of movies where the cowboys and the other people just go right out and slaughter them, and use a theme that's quite interesting in and of itself, that is, we killed the Indians because they were savages. We never quite think about the irony of that kind of statement, right? In other words, we savaged them because they were savages. We killed them because they were savages. And many of us sat in movies and took that philosophy in. So the people who were doing the killing and the murdering of a whole nation were doing it for the good. And so we get the phrase, the only good Indian is a what? A dead Indian. You see. And now we see the nation wrestling with these fantasies, renaming the Indians and doing movies and so forth. But it won't wash. It won't wash. We see again then the fantasies that it plays with in terms of African Americans. Now what am I saying then? That as you say in your churches, as we say in psychotherapy, it becomes very important in order for the person to escape their sinful existence, to escape the psychopathology that may be dogging them. It becomes important for them to literally fess up, to come clean and confess their sins, and to atone for what they have done, and to admit the wretchedness of their existence. However, as long as the sinner, as long as the neurotic continues to deny, continues to distort, continues to rationalize, they, in a sense, then continue to cause abuse and trouble. And they continue to do harm and violence to people with which they're in contact. So in a sense then, since white America has not yet admitted its sinful nature, admitted its criminal nature, since it tries to rationalize its basic criminality, it must then continue to project criminality on other people. It must, in a sense, try to make African people responsible for their own enslavement, just as it tries to make the Indian responsible for their own decimation. In other words, then, you have a racist psychological character assassination that is ongoing. The continuing assassination of African people, which you're talking about here today in terms of the Post and other newspapers, the continuing assassination of African people on radio, TV, magazines, and every medium, is an attempt for whites to continue to justify the original crime of enslaving and abusing black people. And consequently then, as long as they can assassinate the characters of our people, as long as they can project that we are innately criminal, that we are innately inferior, they can feel justified in terms of what they have done to us and what they are doing to us and what they will do to us as a people. In order to deny their own criminality, they must then project that criminality on to other people. And you will see then a standard feature of white American society is that of projecting criminality on non-white people. Black people, Indians, Iraqis, it doesn't matter. As a matter of fact, a part of the New World Order is to demonize the third world and use that world as a means for attacking it and exploiting it and maintaining empirical control over it. And it will do that by demonizing and criminalizing non-white people. We've seen it in Panama, we've seen it in Grenada, and as I mentioned, we've seen it in Iraq. And now you can bet your bottom dollar that these people are in search of other enemies at this point. Because you see, ladies and gentlemen, the military-industrial complex is a complex that needs a chronic enemy, because that complex has become so vital to American economic stability. And so consequently, the nation literally has to stay in a permanent war mode if it's not to undergo drastic reorganization of its social and political system. Consequently, then, it is literally forced to demonize other people and to criminalize other people as a basis for maintaining its own economic social system. And this is what we're talking about then when we talk about a scapegoat psychology. Some people were baffled when Bush, in the matter of a month or two, could turn Hussein from a friend into a devil. But when you understand what we call real politics, there's nothing baffling about it at all. Because the one constant that goes on in foreign policy is that of self-interest. And that's the only thing you're concerned with. If it maintains your self-interest, at one moment to say a person is your best friend, then you say that they're your best friend. If it maintains your self-interest to the very next moment to say that they're your bitterest enemy, then you say that they're your bitterest enemy, you see. And this is the kind of game. In fact, the phrase is that nations do not have permanent friends, they only have permanent interests. And consequently, when nations try to maintain their so-called internal coherence, they will make or break outsiders as a means of doing so. The black community then within this nation is used as that kind of regulating mechanism. It regulates the wholeness of the white community by performing the role of the scapegoat. This nation continues to practice direct white upon black violence. We see it, of course, in the lynching that occurred in Howard Beach, the lynching in Bensonhurst, the lynching in various other communities in the society. So even though we talk about lynching as something that occurred in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, we can see that lynchings are still a part of the American landscape this very day. We see, of course, direct assault on the black community through police brutality. In New York City and environs, I think we can list well over 300 or more cases, or approaching 400 cases or more of police brutality against members of the black community. Of course, we're familiar with the King case out there in California, with cases that occur here now. That means, ladies and gentlemen, through its police force, the white American society is directly assaulting the black community. And these are the cases we hear about. We must multiply these cases we hear about many-fold to get some idea of the continuing violence being practiced against the black community. We see violence even once it is practiced, as in Benson, her son, who returned home, which is quite a twist on the mythology we read about, by the way, comes home and finds 3 white males robbing his house, and is murdered by these 3 males. These males are arrested, indicted, the first one taken to trial, convicted, I believe of second-degree murder or something like that, and the judge gives him probation. And of course, we're familiar with the Bensonhurst outcomes. This is a major violence against the black community. This kind of injustice sends all types of messages to the white community, of course, to let it know that it basically can attack the black community with impunity. It sends a message to the black community that we are extremely vulnerable, that our abuse will not be repatriated or will not be paid for, that we will suffer further injustice to being attacked as a people. It means then that the message is being sent out that we ourselves are unworthy people. and that we ourselves were fated to be the objects of violence of the people. And there are other implications I don't have time to go into today. So the thing that I want to impress upon you then is the fact that this is a violent society. When you compare this society to other societies in terms of the number of people in jail, its murder rates, assault rates, whether you're talking about blacks or whites, you will see that it is #1 in terms of violence. As I think Ralph Brown said, violence is as American as his apple pie, and that is very true. And when you have then a violent society, it produces violence. When the white American society then projects criminality on black people, that is, stereotypically sees blacks as criminals, this is not a mere ego defense where they do that just to justify their treatment of blacks. You must recognize when a segment of the society is very powerful and has material and other influence over the subordinate segments of a society, their projections are not mere accusations. They are not mere stereotypes. They are not mere projection of negative images. When they have the power that they have, these projections presented by these powerful people become what we call creative efforts. In other words, they create and bring into reality the stereotypes that they project. Because in deceiving themselves and in making themselves perceive the black community as a criminal community, as an inferior community, in controlling then job opportunities, in controlling other material aspects of black life, in controlling education, in controlling health services and so forth, they then will organize these services, they will dispense these services, these jobs, and these opportunities in line with their projections, in line with their perceptions. And therefore they will create the material, social, and psychological conditions for driving large segments of our communities into criminal behavior. This, of course, is what we then call the self-fulfilling prophecy. Once the so-called criminals are created, then they use their concrete existence to confirm their projection in the first place and to justify what they were doing in the first place, and now you get caught up in a vicious cycle and a loop out of which it's difficult to break. And this is the kind of game that we are caught up in. America, being bred in violence, having originated in violence, as I've indicated, still practices violence very directly, but it also practices it insidiously and indirectly through what we call benign neglect. I think that's Moynihan's term, right? Benign neglect. How can neglect be benign? Particularly on the level that he was talking about. You know, I just see people who are willing to pay taxes, who will go into a panic on April 15th and are in terror of the IRS, you know, rushing down to the post office at midnight, making sure they get their taxes in. People who will have unemployment, insurance, or whatever, compensation paid out of their checks, Social Security paid out of their checks before they can even get their hands on them, who will pay sales taxes and all other kind of taxes and pay lotto and all of this kind of thing, and yet accept the idea that the government should not be concerned with their welfare. Whose government is it? Whose money is it? And yet who feel ashamed when they may be unemployed to go to their own government and ask for aid and feel that they have the right to receive aid. The wealth and treasury of the government is a commonwealth. What kind of society is it that lays its wealth into a common treasury and then makes its citizens feel ashamed to benefit from that treasury? What kind of people are we that we buy that kind of philosophy? What kind of people are we that will have a nation that leaves some 30 to 40 million people uninsured in terms of their health, so that they can be devastated or not even be able to visit a clinic or a doctor, and yet saps them for money at every turn? This neglect then is not benign. Mothers who cannot go to child health clinics, or mothers who go through a whole of the pregnancy often without visiting the doctor at all, or mothers then who produce low birth weight children, low weight for date children, children who suffer various sorts of problems, children whose intellectual and social potentials are distorted and impaired, and whose learning capacities are impaired, and therefore become a social burden to the nation and, more importantly, to a people themselves. And yet we see this kind of thing going on. Let's look a minute at health neglect as stated by LaSalle Lafave in the State of Black America, 1990. In spite of a century of overall improvement in the health of Americans, statistics show a persistent negative disparity between the health status of blacks and other minorities and that of the population as a whole. The alarming decline in black life expectancy, what are we talking about here? Black life expectancy is getting shorter at birth. Over the last several years, emphasizes the fact that life expectancy at birth for the nation's black populations stands now at a level achieved by whites over 30 years ago. What are we saying here? That our life expectancy is at the point where whites were 30 years ago. So what kind of progress are we talking about? And it's going backwards, not forward. This is the result of so-called benign neglect. What are we saying then, ladies and gentlemen? That people are being killed and murdered and abused in terms of neglect. You see, original violence, which was direct against the Indians and direct against the Africans, we would have some people say, well, you know, that was back then, you know, it has nothing to do with it now. It's not true. What happens in the evolution of persons who've experienced traumatic events early in their lives is they go through what we call a repetition compulsion. They continue to create violence, but it's a violence often that's covered over by other things. But when you look deeply into their personality and their behavior, you will see that violence is still a part of their life. It may be hidden, but it's still there. Now, what has happened in this modern American society is that it continues to visit death upon its original victims, but it has sort of distanced itself from that death. Sort of like those pilots who flew over Iraq and dropped bombs on the population and destroyed the populations of those people over there, and yet could get away with it because they weren't there to see it directly, and therefore are made to think of themselves as less violent than other people. Yet there is no nation. This is the most violent, murderous nation upon this earth today. And yet it dares project itself as a moral paragon among nations. It is a nation that talks about how it does not want third world nations and to have atomic weapons and other weapons because they're irresponsible. And yet it is the only nation that has dropped 2 bombs upon other people. And it has used the most advanced weapons against other people. But of greater importance is the murder that occurs somewhat silently, or that is hidden behind political and ideological rationales, but that is occurring just the same. To quote LaSalle again, it is an irrefutable fact that people of the lowest socioeconomic status have higher death rates almost every form of disease and disability is more prevalent among the poor. So to be poor is not to suffer from a mere absence of money and income. It is to suffer from a shortened life chance. It is to expose one's health to vulnerability, and ultimately it is to put oneself in harm's way. He goes on to say, the task force on black minority health revealed that there were 60,000 more minority deaths per year based upon an expectation of equal death rate for blacks and whites. What are we saying here? 60,000 black people dying per year who really don't need to die if you had true equality and a responsible healthcare system in America. So the benign neglect of money harm and others does not have a benign effect on the black community. It represents death and degradation for that community. And it means again then that the criminal and murderous origins of America are still expressing themselves every day in the lives of our people. And this is the thing that we have to concern ourselves with. We have seen under the Reagan administration a tremendous transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. And a lot of us talk about equality in this country, but we often don't recognize what equality would require. Many of us are not prepared for the kind of struggle that gaining so-called true equality will require in this country. Those of you who cry for equality in America, not revolution, do not recognize you are still making a revolutionary cry. To move blacks into equality with whites would be a revolution, in this country. It requires a tremendous reorganization of the society, ladies and gentlemen. A tremendous transfer of wealth and power from the white community to the black community. Some of us talk very easily about reparations. Well, reparations, of course, means what? A transfer and movement of tremendous sums of money and wealth into the black community from the white community. It means as well almost a complete reorganization of the white community's perception of black people and its relationship to black people. And there's serious questions as to whether white America is willing to undertake that kind of transfer of wealth and change in perception. It can pay Indians as long as they're out there on the reservations. But can it really pay black Americans and at the same time provide equality in this so-called system? I doubt it very seriously. In fact, if we look at the Reagan years, we'll see a situation where the top 1% of the society had an income increase of 85% before taxes. And at the same time, got something like a 23% reduction in its tax rates. And we see the lower 20% in the society losing income at a rate of 12% and its tax rate going up from 3 to 5%. What does that mean then? A tremendous transfer of wealth from the poorest segments of the society to the richest segments of the society. I think there's a portion in my book where I make the comment that really, when you look at so-called criminals in terms of class, I said something like, the poor rob houses and the rich rob nations. And this is what we have here. The rich rob the nation. They don't have to mug in the street. That doesn't mean that they're less criminal. It just means that they have another means by which to rob. Why knock somebody in the head when you can work for an S&L and just rob the whole people and make them pay the bill? And we call them white-collar crimes, as if they're not robbing you just the same. Marion Wright Edelman talks about this neglect in the State of Black America in 1989. Despite significant progress in reducing U.S. infant mortality rate. The rate for blacks remains twice as high as that for whites. In 1986, where white babies died at the rate of 8.9 per thousand, non-white children were at 15.7, blacks were at 18.0 per thousand. This is murder, ladies and gentlemen. In 1990, there were 16 times as many measles cases as in 1983. You're hearing about the measles epidemic that is beginning to recur in the society. This is the result of benign neglect. And the kind of measles now that is coming back seems to be more vicious than the original form and is occurring at an earlier point in these children's lives. I think now, Dr. McIntyre could probably clarify this, the measles attacks are occurring before age 5, early in the life of these children. The immunization initiative is but 20% less than the levels recommended. This is death and damnation. America's child poverty rates have been growing and are levels well above any year in the 1970s. The recession years of the 1970s and 80s saw an average of 750,000 poor children a year. The budget offers no steps to deal with the recession or to reduce the poverty. So what do we have in here again? Death. Let's look quickly at what I call educational neglect. Again, quoting from Marion Wright Edelman in 1989, The State of Black America, for that by the Urban League. The education president, she says, proposes to abandon much of the federal government role supporting school improvement. And you saw the other day, he ballyhooed a much heralded educational platform. No additional monies or anything at all involved here. He will still dump the cost of the educational burden on the cities and the states. Despite Head Start's proven effectiveness, the progress has never been funded at levels which would allow it to meet the needs of all eligible children. Hundreds of thousands of children are on Head Start's waiting list. What are we talking about here? We're talking about early childhood education. I'm currently completing a book on the education of the African American child. I'm dealing at this point with early childhood education, its long-term effects. When we look over the effectiveness of early childhood programs, we note that these programs not only improve the academic capacities of these children, and not only increases their IQ, their intelligence, and their social relations capacities and so forth. They have the long-term benefits of course, having those students who've undergone this education as a whole to drop out of school at a lower rate than children who have not gone to these programs, to graduate obviously at a higher rate, to gain gainful employment at a higher rate. Fewer of them will be engaged in juvenile delinquency or ultimately grow up to commit crime. Fewer of them will be on the welfare rolls. Fewer of them will really be involved in any kind of criminal activity and so forth. In other words, we find that investment in early childhood programs pays off both academically and socially, and pays off in terms of pro-social behavior on the parts of those people who attend those programs. Yet this government has chosen not to fund or to drastically underfund those early childhood programs. Over 86% of American children from all income groups are educated in the public school system, yet the public schools are failing to educate. Poor teens are 4 times as likely to have poor basic skills as are teens with family incomes above poverty. Yet we have a nation that does not make a national policy of seeing to it that none of its families fall below the poverty line. A negative income tax or other kinds of policies could be used so that we could ensure that no family in the society falls below the poverty level. Yet, believing in laissez-faire capitalism and Reaganite conservatism, we permitted then the leaders of this nation to project a careless attitude toward the population and therefore abuse our people and create criminality in our people in the name of so-called the market economy. Among teens living in poverty, more than 6 out of 10 black teens fall in the lowest quintile of the skills group, that is the lowest 20%. Youths who by age 18 have had the weakest reading and math skills are 8 times more likely to have children out of wedlock. So what we talk about here, these children we undereducate, these children we miseducate, these children whose early education is not invested in are also those people who will grow up to have the most children themselves. As a matter of fact, they are the group that's essentially keeping the race alive. Yes, because us middle classes don't have many children if we have any at all. We don't really reproduce hardly our own class. And yet we're letting people produce and maintain the race who are the least fit in many ways from a cultural point of view, who are the least supported by the society, their children. This is a violence against the black community, and it is a condition for creating violence in the black community. So we say they are 8 times more likely to have children out of wedlock. They are 9 times more likely to drop out of school before graduation. 5 times more likely to be both out of work and out of school. And let me say something about this out of work situation. Many people often think that when people are unemployed, they think of the person themselves as being unemployed. Well, he didn't get the job. Keep this in mind, ladies and gentlemen, when he is a father or she is a mother, you are unemployed in a sense, a whole family. When a young man is not getting a job, you're talking about a young man who, though he's had a child out of wedlock, cannot marry because of the uncertainty of his income or the instability of his income. Not only then is he reluctant to marry, or is the woman reluctant to marry him because she doesn't see any material gain as a result of marrying him, or the system organizes its support to her in such a way that says, in a sense, you have to keep them outside in order to get minimum support. In addition to that, a psychology is produced within the family. When a man is unemployed or a woman is unemployed, there is a psychological dynamic that develops in the family. The man's dealing with his own masculinity, his own inability to provide for his family, his concern with his authority, which is based on his ability to provide. The attitude often of the woman, he's still thinking often that he should be the final word and the final authority, until one day she tells him, I'm earning the money in here. And I'm the one who's responsible for keeping this family alive. So, he has to sit back. Now, out of that, of course, often comes a man who's going to insist that he's the last word, and often may insist in a way that brutalizes or abuses the wife and creates all kind of psychological abuse within the family itself. What am I saying here then? In a system that does not provide for the employment of this population and does not support those that are unemployed due to no fault of their own, that system creates negative family dynamics. It creates stresses within family systems. It creates stresses within communities. It creates traumatic relationships between people. And out of these stresses and confusions and uncertainties and so forth arises violence. And that violence is going to occur within that family, within that community, within that race. And then we'll have the outside community saying that this family or this race or this group is violent innately, that we have nothing to do with it. We have here then that these youth who are out here dropping out of school and so forth are 4 times more likely to be forced to turn to public assistance for basic income support. Young women with 4 basic skills, whether black, white, or Hispanic, are more than 3 times as likely to be parents as those with average or better skills. 18 and 19-year-old men with 4 basic skills are 3 times as likely to be fathers as those with average basic skills. The federal Chapter 1 compensatory education program supports remedial education programs serving poor children, but this cost-effective program, that is, if you invest on the front end of these children's education, these children will come to contribute to the society and cost the society far less than not investing. But we have a system here, and we have a state here that is paying now almost $50 million a month for prisons, and yet will cut the budgets in schools, as we see in New York City, will cut budgets in city universities and its universities and schools, particularly now that they are black, and then pay out millions and millions of dollars in order to incarcerate black males. It's a backwards type of system. By investing, and they're willing to pay from from $30,000 to $50,000 a year per inmate to put a black man in jail, and they have millions of them in jail. As a matter of fact, so many that they could make up a city as large as Detroit. They're willing to make that kind of investment, but will not invest $4,000 a year per child and reap the benefits thereof, which lets you know, ladies and gentlemen, that there is a deep factor of racism involved in the way the government dispenses its income. Time is going rapidly here. Let's see then. So they fund these programs to only about half, for only half of the low-income students in need of its assistance. Between 1979 and 1985, federal funding for Chapter 1 dropped roughly 29%. Chapter 2 served only 54, Chapter 1 served only 54 students for every 100 poor school-age children in 1985, down from 75 students in 1980. So, yes, we're getting a regression. So let me sum up this segment here. What I have said so far then is that America originated in violence, and that violence still expresses itself in both direct and indirect ways. It expresses itself in the form of so-called benign neglect. It expresses itself in terms of the cutting of programs, the transfer of wealth, the underfunding of education. It expresses itself by the kinds of psychological dynamics it creates within the black families and in the black community. It expresses itself in terms of the general values of this country. We don't have time, of course, to talk about the nature of this so-called market society, which projects personal gain, selfish gains, above the common good. Reagan, of course, projected this kind of philosophy perfectly, and the 80s was the decade of the me generation. It produces desire, and if you have a chance, you read in my book about the production of desire, how the society creates desires in our people that it cannot fulfill. Makes them think that they're nothing if they don't have an 8-ball jacket, or they're nothing if they don't have a certain type of sneaker. They're nothing if they don't drink Pepsi, or this or that, and yet robs them of the capacity to purchase the very things it says is so important to their self-esteem and their sense of self-worth. This is a trick, and this trick creates violence. It is a nation that depends upon the insult to black people's personalities. How many of you seen Mother Love, this new show or something? Yes, good. But what I heard, I haven't seen it, but what I heard is it's a miserable show. Someone said she did a little interview with somebody on that show. I think athlete or something, who claims that he went into a store one day, a white-owned store, and he asked the price of a shirt, and the owner, the white owner says, well, you don't need to bother to ask about that because you can't afford this shirt, and he walks away, and the white girl comes over, and he asks her again, what's the price of the shirt? Well, this shirt is $275, and this one is $200, and this one is so forth. Give me 10 of them, he said. Now, what's going on there? Of course, being an athlete, he has plenty of money, right? But what's the psychological dynamic operating here? A man reacting to what? Insult. You see? But he reacts to his insult with a, I'm going to show you kind of thing. And this is the kind of game that black America is caught into. Tony Brown says in a sense, if you want to get a black person's money, insult him first. Then he'll give it to you. So the very person that insults you is the very person you go back and give your money to try to get rid of the original insult. That is why they will never release you from the insult, because the insult is too lucrative. You see, this is the kind of game we have. Dealing with the insult that has been placed upon us by the projection I talked about earlier. We overbuy, overconsume, and we get a rush when we give the very people who insult us most all of our money. Now let's look then at the next category, and I'll go rapidly through this. As I said, I can only give you an outline here. As a result of the projecting onto us by this white American community, as a result of the direct and indirect violence practiced upon the black community, there is a psychology produced within the collective psyche of that community. Those psychological states include a sense of powerlessness and hopelessness. And when I talk about hopelessness, I'm not just talking about where you just give up. Certainly there's hopelessness that breeds apathy. But there's a certain hopelessness that says, well, this is a white man world, he always had it, he always will have it, so I'm going to go to get the best I can within that parameter. That's sort of like middle class kind of hopelessness. So you don't lay back and give up, you work real hard, but you don't work to overthrow or take power from the people who rule over you. You just work and see how you can manipulate their power and use their power to gain yourself some status. That is a form of hopelessness too, as well. In this psychology is also that of the internalization of racist attitudes and self-negation. We often talk about then how we look at our own selves through the eyes of the white community and judge ourselves through the eyes of the white community. When we do so, then it means that we have internalized white racism and the white racist attitudes toward ourselves. It leaves us then with a sense of frustration, a sense of insatiable and unrealistic desires. We can never get what we ultimately want. We'll never ultimately fulfill. Even those of us who've made it high into the social hierarchy of this system still feel that there is something missing. We feel a frustration that leads to anger and apathy and gets us engaged in fantasy. We are dealing here then with a displacement of aggression, which is one of the major roots of criminality and abuse, where we act out, not against those who abuse us, but against victims like ourselves. And if we are not acting out against our fellow victims, we act in against ourselves, in the form of poor health habits, in the form of drug addictions and other kinds of addictions, which are slow forms of suicide or in direct suicidal acts themselves. We're left in with the general state of what we might call self-destructive behavior, which can occur on many different levels and in many different forms. There's a psychology of what we call the imitation of the aggressor. We hear people say, well, I don't want my children to be any different from their children. I want us to have, the same thing. Do you really realize what you're saying? You really want your children to be just like little white children? You really want your children to be like the children of enslavers, children who are still benefiting from the death and damnation and the enslavement and the degradation of our people? These are the children and these are the people whom you want your children to be just like? You mean you want your children to share equally in a system that is built upon what I said earlier, the death and murder and degradation of other people, that is still living upon the interest rates that involve the murder of our people, then you're saying you want your children to become engaged in criminality the world over. So we have to change. The issue then is not one of not getting an equal chance in the system. The issue is that the system itself needs to be destroyed and reorganized. If you're going to imitate white folks, then you become a part and parcel of their criminality. And that's why our black men and women were in the Middle East. That's why our black men and women in Grenada. That's why our black men and women were in Panama. That's why they'll be in Africa or anywhere else they decide to land with our black men and women. And one day, ladies and gentlemen, if you let them go to war against black people in Panama, if you let them go to war against black people in Grenada, if you let them go to war against non-white people in the so-called Middle East and black people there, and go to war in Africa against black people, you're going to look up one day and your own sons and daughters will be going to war against you here in America.
Check it out.
Because the psychology is already okay. So we have to recognize then this imitation of whites is not a healthy goal for our people. And therefore those who imitate whites, and I show in the book there that the black-on-black violent criminal is a white racist man in blackface. When you look at the psychology of the black-on-black violent criminal, you will see that it is the same psychology that motivates the white racist. It is the psychology of the people who killed Indians. It is the psychology of people who enslaved black folks. It is the psychology of people who will use and abuse other people to achieve their own self-centered and self-concerned goals. Another part of that psychology, of course, is alienation, self-centeredness, and short-sightedness. Chronic and acute stress, interpersonal and intrapersonal conflict, confusion, and uncertainty. Compensatory reactions, the denial of reality, and the distortion of reality. I want you just to keep the outline in mind here because we're wrapping it up. We're going in there from what? The origins of this nation and murder and degradation, the direct violence of this nation, the indirect violence of this nation, the kind of psychological state that it puts black people in as a result of this kind of violence. Now, the people who are at the point of destroying themselves the most, if we can say that, or who we see destroying themselves to a very great extent, are those youngsters between the ages of 15 and 24. It is in some areas of this country, I'm quoting from the New York Times here recently, in some areas of this country, it is now more likely for a black male between his 15th and 25th birthday to die from homicide than it was for a United States soldier to be killed on a tour of duty in Vietnam. The figures show that the rate among black males was rising fastest among those ages 15 to 19, indicating that violent death was becoming increasingly a problem among adolescents. I wish I had time to talk to you about what that means. It means the very crop, the cream of the crop of the race is being destroyed before it can even move into manhood. And just think about the psychological implications of that. Men who will not marry, men who will not produce families and so forth, are people whose death create traumatic events within the families when they are killed, or kids who murdering other kids create traumatic psychological situations within their own families. Think of the amount of social stress and trauma that occurs both to the families of those that are killed and to the families that contain the killers. And you will see then that a killing of a young man on the street and the young man that kills him is something that spreads out through the community as a whole. It is not a mere incident between two people. It is an incident that involves two families, families of people, ultimately communities of people, and ultimately races of people. Now attitudes, and these kind of things. When you combine that psychological state, which is common to all of black folk, regardless of class level, with adolescence, you get a lethal mixture here. Because one of the major problems of adolescence, and I just named them, I want to explain them. Think about what an adolescent is involved in at that point. He's involved in issues of self-concept. Who am I? What am I? He's usually in this culture in an identity crisis. Who shall I be? What will I be? Gender identity crisis. Am I a man or a woman? What does it mean to be a man or a woman, and so forth? He's involved with his sexual identity. They're involved with self-esteem. They're involved often with rejecting the norms of the society. They're involved with issues of masculinity. They're involved here with their body image, with their emotional lability. That is, you see this moodiness often in many adolescents as they struggle to bring their emotions under control. They're engaged in trying to gain social acceptance, to deal with their peers. They're engaged with the alienation that occurs during adolescence. They're engaged with how they're going to use their intellectual and cognitive capacities. They are questioning the morals of the society. They're having the values conflicts. They're concerned with their vocational choices, their clothes, their cars, symbols of status, and invidious comparisons between themselves. So what are we saying here? We got the regular adolescent concerns, which are in and of themselves stressful enough and confusing enough, now conjoining with the standard psychological state that occurs as a result of fight-on-flight violence. And you can begin to see why it's going to move these kids toward the behaviors that we've just described. Now then, it is not enough, though, just to see the psychology of us in general and see the psychology of adolescents in general. You must throw one more thing into the pot to bring these ingredients together and produce what we call a synergistic reaction. That is where a group of substances or a group of causes combine to produce a larger cause. Whereas these causes by themselves may not create as much of a problem. When they join with other causes, they bring about a major problem. That is, we have to now look at the context in which black-on-black violence occurs. We find many of us comparing ourselves as adults. When I was young, we weren't this way, we weren't that way. These youngsters today are this way and that way. Every generation of youngsters is different from the prior generation. You have to keep that in mind. Because every generation of youngsters is living in a completely different social and cultural context than the prior generation. So when you're comparing yourself to the youngsters, your early years with these youngsters, you must remember the context in which you existed as against the context in which these youngsters exist today. And I think you will begin to realize that these youngsters are dealing with a context that's far more devastating in many ways. Let's look at that context. They're dealing in the context of unemployment, poverty, overcrowded, ghetto life. Many of us still remember rural existence, southern existence, small community existence, family existence, and things like this. Well, now you're dealing with urbanized youth, the largest percentage of them put into the cities of this country. So they're dealing with urbanization. They're dealing with the post-industrial age, which means all of the industries have been shipped out of this country. A large part of them have been shipped out. In the old days, when you dropped out in the 8th grade, you could go to the factories, you could go to the automobile plants, you could go to the dockyard, you could go to the stockyard, you could go here and there and make a decent living. Those things are not out there now. You see, and you have to see what that means. We're in an information processing age. Today, basically, you're either processing information and data or you're on the lower level service job. There are hardly any ones in between. And the black community is getting ready to be crushed again because this country is making a treaty with Mexico and Canada where it is getting ready literally to ship out the rest of its industries and leave this country almost completely de-industrialized. And if the black community does not wake up and realize what is going on, we are going to be in a major, major squeeze. And an example of that squeeze, of course, is Detroit. And if you look at what's going on in Detroit today, you will see it is a major part, the result of the moving of those industries out of Detroit and leaving black people in those situations. Rising expectations. This is the context, family dissolutions. Up until the 1860s, we were still talking about two-headed black families. You got youngsters now who are dealing with, yes, we're bringing it here, who are dealing here with what? Single-headed families and all this. The larger percentages up as teenagers didn't have to deal with this kind of family situation. Others look at the other context again, television and mass marketing, where the television directly focuses on adolescence. Conservative politics, mood today, demographic changes, social, political disorganization. We're still talking about context here. The absence of dysfunctional social institutions. On top of that, the availability of weapons. Look at your years and see how available the weapons were compared to their availability today. The availability of drugs. Oh yeah, you had problems drinking beer and liquor. Well, look at the problems today with the kinds of drugs they have today. And the lack of an economic niche. We as a black community has permitted every other community to gain some kind of economic niche. And we ourselves have not gained one. We'll see Pakistanis or whoever at the newsstand, and the Koreans in the fruit stores, and the Arabs in the smoke shops, and the Italians in the pizza shops, whatever. Each group got something, got a niche in the economic system. But this black community is one of consumers. And consequently, because it has no outstanding niche in the economic system here, it has nowhere to place its children. And in a sense, by not having an economic niche, we literally put our children in a situation to create one, and often the one they create is that of selling drugs. What are my recommendations here then? The recommendations are this. If we're going to get rid of a lot of this black on black violence, we train the children in conflict resolution skills, and I'm taking this from an article by Carvell in the State of Black America in 1990. Community board programs, community-based programs for youth and family counseling. Support for families is very important that families get support. We need to reduce acquired biological factors, that is head injuries and other kind of injuries that are also the causes of violence. Control firearms. Enhance racial identity. We don't have time. But on the other level, we have to make some changes in family, cultural, and educational changes. We must produce antidotes to these psychological states. We must make appropriate education and job training available to our people. We must reorganize the values of our children. We must help them to gain insight into themselves and to discern evil from good. We must train them in frustration, tolerance, self-control. We must give them long-term cultural and personal goals and transcendent goals. We must develop a nation within a nation. We must educate them in regards to drugs, in regards to media manipulation. We must educate them in terms of police, and we must engage in reorganizing police activities themselves. From the level of police action, of political action, we must try to get these conservative administrations out of office. And these Democrats who suddenly become neoconservative must not continue to depend upon the black vote. We must lobby for our early childhood education programs, protest vigorously when the state reduces programs that are important to our community, and of course continue to press for civil rights, and those of us who claim we know better should run for a political office and not complain merely because others are in those offices not doing what they should. In terms of economic action, we must economically reorganize the black community. We must boycott these businesses and run them out of the community and make them for ourselves. I must say this, we don't have to justify the removal of Koreans out of these communities based on any knocking down of women and mistreating of children. As I told you before, we don't owe the Koreans anything. Our black men gave their lives to Koreans. Our tax money went to Korea to build this economy and so forth. We don't owe them a damn thing. And we don't have to feel guilty for saying at this point, during de-industrialization, when there are no more industry jobs and dockyard jobs and other jobs, that we can no longer afford to give our money control our community internally. We must build a national economic system. I saw some people over there in Africa with the big international conference on economics. And that's good, Reverend Sullivan and all the rest of you. That's wonderful. But please, black leaders, demonstrate your capacity to organize blacks in America. So a typical black kind of game, they're going to solve the problems of the world and not deal with the ones at home. We must do that. We got to create appropriate economic institutions and appropriate economic coalitions with our people at home and abroad. And we must protest the U.S. initiatives which may hurt the community. There are other things here, but I wanted to give you that outline, hoping that if you look at it closely, you'll see in it a program for reforming the situation that we're in today as African men, women, and children. Thank you very much for your attention.
Oh, Amos, I want to thank you so very much for that marvelous lecture. I just want to move along very quickly because I know you want to ask him a few questions. I want to encourage all of you that like what we're doing to support us by joining Samotep, by becoming a member. You see Sister Almeda Coleman on my right. Also, we've got to be out of here by 4 o'clock, so we're going to do as much as we can so that we can be out by 4 o'clock. These are the orders of theater, and we must comply. I'm going to bring Brother McIntosh back to the microphone, and while he's coming, this is a copy of Professor Amos Wilson's book. They're sold out, but I urge you to get a copy from Liberation Bookstore. Where else can they get it? English?
And all of the black bookstores.
All the black bookstores will have it.
Street vendors. Yes.
Street vendors. So this is a copy of it, Black on Black Violence. I urge you to get a copy of it. Dr. McIntosh.
Okay, brothers and sisters, Brother Amos touched on something right on the end that is in line with what I'm getting ready to present to you right now. I want to do a quick vote on certain things that Samotep is doing to find out whether or not you are for it, whether or not you support it, whether or not you think that it's something we need to do. Keep in mind the word need, whether it's something we should keep doing. Do you think that we should keep mailing the announcements to our programs, that when people call and want the addresses and phone numbers of the radio stations where racist media is being perpetrated, that we should mail those things out? How many people think we should still do that? Raise your hands. Okay, good. You can do it by applause. That's the same, just as good. How many of you think that we should have a telephone to answer people's requests about, clap your hands if you believe that, okay? How many people think that we should continue a monthly lecture series in which we have speakers of the caliber of... How many people think that we should have a big sign out front like we have in front of every month? How many people think that we should put out a newsletter quarterly and keep that going out front? How many people think that we should invest our money to purchase products like the beautiful handbags, the beautiful t-shirts, sweatshirts, so on and so forth? Okay. How many people feel that the executive committee ought to invest a little money every now and then to rent a space to meet in between the meetings so that we can put black spectrum theater is not available, and Brother Carl Clay, isn't able to make it available to us sometimes. How many people think that we should donate to the church that allows us to use the space that we use? Last question. How many people think that we should give an honorarium or some money to the speakers of the caliber of Amos Wilson who come and speak to us? Okay. If you believe that we need to do that, instead of me going through the jokes that I usually go through about, you don't have to pay money to go across the bridge, just stay home and I'll write your doctor's note and all that. Let's be serious adults about this particular thing. There are people who said to me that it's embarrassing for Samotep to beg for money. And you're right. But we have been called, and Amos alluded to it, of people who buy what they want and beg for what they need. You have all applauded and told me that you believe we need those things that I just said. And because we need those things, I've got to ask you for some money right now. I'm asking you for some money, and I'm not at all embarrassed. If anybody's embarrassed me, please save your embarrassment for yourself. You're walking around with jeans with Calvin Klein's name on your butt and embarrassed about me. Be embarrassed about yourself if you're embarrassed about Samotec having to ask for money. We have to ask for money because we have these things to do, so that we don't have to go to the city or the state or the federal government or go begging anybody to let us stay in there. We're going to have a roof over our heads. Now because we've been pushing the building fund, we haven't asked for the money for our operating expenses. I just did a review for you. The telephone, the message service, the mailing, the newsletter, all those things are things that cost money, and we have to support it. If you're wondering where that money is going to come from, how many people out there have HBO? Clap your hands. Come on, tell the truth.
One of our Samotec members, but he's very well known to most of you. He's an author, a writer in his own right, Claude Brown. Claude, would you want to... Of course, he's written far more books than Man-Child from the Promised Land, but I think we all remember him for that very marvelous book. He appeared to hear his brother, Amos Wilson. He said he wouldn't miss it for the world. Brothers and sisters, I'm going to bring Professor Amos Wilson back to the microphone very briefly. What time is it? Someone please give me the time. Okay. We're going to take 3 questions. We're going to ask that you come to the front of the auditorium and line up, just 3 of you, please, because we'd like you to have the opportunity to ask questions. Yes, right here, right here. And I'll bring Amos back to the microphone as soon as he and Claude gets there. Just want to remind you again to purchase the book, Black on Black Violence, The Psychodynamics of Black Self-Annihilation in Service of White Domination by Professor Amos Wilson. We're going to take our first question. Would you just state your name and your question?
My name is Donald Greenwell, and I'd like to ask a quick 2-part question. One is, with wise men like you, thank God, appearing on TV more and more to clarify the truth about what's really going on in the world, are you getting much opportunity to, first of all, be on TV? Is anybody working with you to get you on TV more, to clarify a lot of the falsehoods? And number 2, as a result of the wonderful experience of getting this wisdom that the majority of our people don't get, I think it's very important that we all think in terms of leaving here and planning committees and having specific strategies to take advantage of this wonderful knowledge. And I'd like to know your general responses to how we can move toward implementing this information, which people like you are, providing.
Thank you very much. We did this standard thing, and when we published our book, we released, of course, a press release, and the book was sent around to quite a number of people who talked to us on these issues. As a matter of fact, what I did was to include a summary of all of the chapters, because I know often your hosts don't have time to read what you sent them. And it's tough when you go on an interview about your book and the host hasn't even looked at the table of contents, let alone, and sometimes almost not at the title. And they come from left field. So we summarize chapters. I also send a list of 15 questions so that all the host would have to do is just look at the questions and focus very directly on issues having to do with black on black violence. So this was a package that we sent to the people who normally present us and the popular issues we have to the black community. We're still waiting to hear from those people. I guess what the Bible says, and I don't want to call myself a prophet, but refer to that chapter in the sense that a prophet is more honored outside than inside. So it seems as if I can get TV interviews, radio stuff like that outside of New York much more rapidly than within New York City. The reasons, I really can't tell you. We've been trying to figure it out, but somehow it's difficult for us to figure out why. Perhaps sometimes I get a reputation of some kind of radical, or the fact that I would call white folk criminals apparently upsets some people, and it's not quite what the world is ready to hear or put up with. And the fact that my major recommendation is that we have to end white power, break the arms of white power, and I make no bones about that. You are not going to get to the heaven that you desire as long as you leave power, inordinate power, in the hands of white folk. It ain't possible. Trying to get them to be nice and all that is not going to work. They can be nice to you one season, they can be the other way in the next season. I do kind of sort of go into seclusion to do the work of the books. However, I am becoming more and more public, as you see here today, and you'll be seeing more of me in the public. I will also, of course, I'm in the process too of getting a book so that the kind of stuff I was talking about here today can be offered over long periods of time. So I will be doing courses, practical workshops, some of them lasting as long as 10 weeks, so that we can train our leaders and train people who are very concerned with the practical approaches to the problem. So keep your eyes open. You will be seeing later on in the year flyers and other things that will be advertising our educational efforts. Yes, ma'am.
I have a microphone. I'm sure I can be heard.
No, they want to record it.
Oh, I see. Good afternoon. I do want to thank you for that wonderful lecture. Do you have any feelings about that Ujamaa Institute?
Yes.
Would you speak on that, please?
I feel very good about it. I have no doubts about it. I think it's an institution that's late in coming. You have to understand that we don't have the time again to talk about this issue. But you must understand, and I know this is going to rouse some ladies, but that the black male is at the most intense front of the attack of white racism. And for good psychological reasons, ladies and gentlemen. Whenever you have a conquering force, a conquering army, and an army that wishes to continue to exploit a conquered population, it is the males who are going to be most intensely oppressed. And that doesn't deny the oppression of females at all. In a sense, to oppress males is to oppress females as well, and to oppress children. However, because the male is seen as the most aggressive member of the species, the most likely, given the tradition that we have, to go to war against oppression and to be the warriors against oppression, they then will be the ones that the oppressor oppresses most. You will see them when you have a conquering army coming into a situation, they will often kill all of the young men, or kill the male boys, and of course kill the adult males, or take them and put them in concentration camps and other kinds of holding facilities, because they recognize the threat posed by males, particularly males then who may be aroused by nationalistic and other motives. So we see a situation here of the black male, and I want you to recognize another thing, and this too I have to leave unexplained due to the time. Literally the whole world and any number of groups that you may identify rests on the back of black males. What am I saying? In other words, the black male is on the bottom of the heap of all of these other groups. And consequently, you will see these other groups being disturbed at any instance where black males look like they're beginning to come together and act in concert against those who oppress them. And I've seen, when I've been out at meetings, and a bunch of us have been at a table, you can see the fear and the curiosity of people trying to figure out what it is about these black men. People get upset when black men have exclusive conferences. Everybody feels that they have a right to invade it and to see what's going on. We're the only group that everybody feels like we don't have a right to privacy. And so what are we saying here then? That the black male has received special negative attention from this system. Consequently, that male has to receive special positive attention from this system. You have to also realize that within the African context, the black male has always received separate training from females. So we're not away from our culture of our tradition. And that black male training for manhood within the within the African tradition was the best training for African women. It was not a training to oppress black women. It was a training to prepare those men to be husbands. It was a training to prepare those men to be adults, training to prepare them to function positively in their environments and so forth. And consequently then, our reinstituting this kind of training is no violation of our tradition, and it has very viable reasons why it should be done. One of these days I'll get a chance to talk to you about education and try to get you to understand the tremendous difference between African-centered education and the common education that you get out here today. It's very, very different. It's not enough just, and we should do it, introduce history into the curriculum. The education of our people must be reorganized from top to bottom, you see. And we don't have time. I wish I could talk to you about it. But the education of the black male, as Reverend Sharp said one day, I see people didn't object when these black males are in these special ed classes. You know, nobody objects to that. Nobody objected when the black males were in 600 schools, you know, for the emotionally disturbed and what have you. Nobody objects, you know, when they're in jail and in these other places. But as soon as you say that you're going to take them somewhere, give them a positive image, give them a positive self-concept and positive self-esteem, and you're going to train them in their history, you're going to train them in knowledge, you're going to train them in the knowledge of their enemy, you're going to give them skills, you're going to train them to have attitudes toward their families, toward their communities and everything. Suddenly everybody gets upset. Well, this lets you know that the enemy of this society is a well-educated and competent black male. Thank you very much.
We promise you the next time that Professor Wilson comes to us to speak, it will be under our own roof and we can stay as long as we like. I'd like to thank this wonderful audience for $927. You were very, very... We're going to bring our forum to a close, but I'd like to say that any member that's sitting in the audience that is one of the original 100 who gave, the first 100 who gave to the building fund, we have your certificates. They're all signed. So as you leave the auditorium, would you please go and pick your certificate up and also check to see if your accounts are in order. We thank you so very much for coming out this evening. We thank Black Spectrum, and we thank Ms. Najima for her assistance, and Carl Clay and everyone. And we look for you on the 18th over at Bethany Baptist Church. Get home safely. Your subscription forms are here. If you're interested in entering the podcast, our forms are right here.
Are you ready?
How are you? Thank you.
You wanted to take today? Vanessa, let me ask you a question.
I would like to make an announcement that I should have made before. The St. Albans Chamber of Commerce will hold a Memorial Day Unity Parade on Memorial Day. And if you'd like to participate in this parade, please contact contact Chamber of Commerce with Purcell Bailey is the person that you need to speak to. And if you'll go downstairs in the gymnasium, there's a wonderful flea market that's going on now, and they even have food if you're a little hungry. So this is the flea market.